Hello everyone, I hope that you can hear me. Welcome to this event to launch Henrietta Liston's Travels, the Turkish Journals 1812 to 1820, just published by Edinburgh University Press, alongside an accompanying digital resource hosted by the National Library of Scotland. I'm Dora Petherbridge and I'm speaking from the National Library in Edinburgh today. And we are joined by attendees from all over the world. So welcome to you all, people in Switzerland, Spain, Ukraine and India. But most importantly, we are joined by our two speakers today, Dr. Özden Mercan, Associate Editor of Henrietta Liston's Travels, who joins us from Antalya in Turkey, and Editor Patrick Hart, who's joining us from California in the United States. Özden's research examines the history of the Eastern Mediterranean in the late medieval and early modern periods, with emphasis on diplomatic, political, and cultural interactions between Western Europe and the Ottoman Empire. She has published on European communities in Turkey, on the diplomatic relations of the Italian states with the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century, and on constructions of the other in the early modern period. Recently, Özden was a fellow at the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies at Columbia University. Patrick Hart is an assistant professor of English literature at Bilkent University in Ankara and founding editor of the Journal of the Northern Renaissance. When not working on Liston and on travel writing about Turkey, his research focuses mostly on 16th and 17th century poetry and on the idea of the literary Baroque. And he is very slowly writing a book on Petrarchism in Scotland and in England. It has been a privilege to work with Patrick and Özden and the whole editorial team on Liston's journals, and to be part of the library's collaboration with Bilkent University and Edinburgh University Press, which has enabled Henrietta Liston's Turkish journals to be published 200 years after she left the Ottoman Empire for the last time. Our colleagues at Bilkent University, Dr. Valerie Kennedy, editor, and contributor Dr. Kenneth Weisbroder aren't speaking today, but their work is threaded through all that we'll talk about during this event. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Valerie and Ken, and to thank everyone who's helped us on this project, everyone at Edinburgh University Press, and my many colleagues at the National Library who have contributed so generously. After our presentations today, we'll open up for a question and answer session at the end. So please feel free to send in your questions as you watch and as you think of them, and we'll have a session at the end of the talk. As well, we are running a little poll today, which has just popped up in your screen, I think. So we would like to know if you are familiar with Lady Mary Waterley Montagu and her Turkish embassy letters. So before I hand over to Patrick, I'll just say a little bit about Henrietta and Robert Liston and where this book began. So our work started with the Liston Papers Archive, an extensive archive of letters, journals, dispatches, official papers, financial paperwork that is stored here, just a few floors beneath where I sit in the strong rooms. And it comprises of about 177 volumes of manuscripts, which look like this, and I'll show you. I hope you can see this rather handsome volume here. And this is just for 2 months of the Liston's stay in 1812. So we had this extraordinary wealth of manuscripts to draw on for our research. So now, if I just share my screen, I will be able to show you what's in, what kind of thing is in the volumes that I just showed you an example of. So if you just bear with me, here we are, and I hope everybody can see this now. So this is just a very small sample of the kind of manuscripts that are in the Liston Papers Archive. And from this wealth of material, we began to piece together the lives of the Listons and their time in the Ottoman Empire. So we have a kind of remarkably rich picture of who they were. And as you can see, there's everything from recipes for Turkish ink to letters in a range of languages and all sorts of fascinating items. Now, in short, because I know we're a little short of time, I would like to tell you about Robert and Henrietta and who they were. Robert was born in 1742 in West Lothian in Scotland, and he entered the diplomatic service in 1774. He didn't have any family origins that would have led him into diplomacy, but he did have a talent for languages, and he came to speak 10 and read 14. Henrietta Marchant was born in 1751 in Antigua. She was orphaned around the age of 8 and then sent pretty much immediately to Glasgow to live with her uncle. And she lived in Glasgow with him till she was about 44 years old when she married Robert, who had just been made British minister to the United States. So in 1796, their honeymoon voyage was to Philadelphia, which was then the capital of the United States. And these two portraits that you can see here are of Robert and Henrietta in 1800 in Philadelphia. So to fast forward a little, now skipping over some diplomatic posts in Europe after the United States. By the time Robert was appointed ambassador to the Sublime Porte at Constantinople in 1812, Henrietta was a seasoned traveller. As diplomat's consort, she had toured the United States and Canada, the West Indies, and Northern Europe, going to Denmark and to Sweden. And she kept journals about all of these travels. So we have in the archive 24 years worth of Henrietta's travel writing. Until now, most of the focus has been on Henrietta's American journals, but it was Patrick who several years ago, on inquiring about material on Turkey held in the library's special collections, who instigated research into Liston's Turkish experience. And he established this collaborative project and brought together the editorial team from the English Literature and History departments at Bilkent University. So our work in earnest began 2 years ago. And if I can navigate to my next slide, there you are, you can see one of the journals being digitized. We began to edit, to digitize, to research, and to piece together the Liston's life in the Ottoman Empire from a variety of manuscripts. We found that Liston's 1812 to 1814 journal formed the centerpiece of our book and of all our work. And you can see it here in all its glory next to our publication, Henrietta Liston's Travels. So the Listons sailed from Portsmouth to Turkey in April 1812, and they arrived in June. Robert was at that point almost 70 years old, and Henrietta was 61. They were the most senior diplomats among the European diplomatic corps in Constantinople. So I'm now going to hand over to Patrick, who will take us to Liston's Constantinople.
Thank you, Dora. I hope everybody can hear me and see me. Thank you to all of you for joining us for this launch of our book. I really appreciated everybody coming, especially when there were so many, such a large distraction going on elsewhere. I'm going to try and keep this fairly short so that we have time for questions. But I wanted to say just a little bit about why I find Liston's journal and her letters so fascinating and worthy of editing and of a book such as this. And I also want to share just a few extracts to give you a flavor, a taste of her writing. Now, there's an obvious source of interest, I think, to Liston's tales. There are remarkable experiences and adventures. She tells tales of politically motivated executions, of murder, of fire ravaging through Pera, through the city of Constantinople, of plague, which Özlem, I know, will say a little bit more about. Tales of shipwreck in the Black Sea, of harems and Turkish baths. But there's also a more quotidian side to her writing, a little more down to earth. She's fascinated by Turkish food. She was a keen botanist and spends pays a great deal of attention to the plant life of Turkey and the Mediterranean on her travels. She talks about the everyday business of travel in the early 19th century, about favorable and contrary winds and so on. But I think what most fascinated me about Liston's writing is really that voice that emerges, which is quite different from what I expected when I first opened this manuscript of an ambassador's wife's travels. I came to Liston, in a sense, from the Turkish embassy letters of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who Dora mentioned, who herself was the wife of a British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. She was writing about 100 years earlier. And I'm sure some of you out there will be familiar with her work. But what's startling is that despite the obvious similarities, there are huge contrasts in the ways they recount their stories. And also in those stories, they differ significantly. Montagu traveled to Istanbul, to Constantinople, by land, traveling through Europe. And she was in her late 20s at the time. Liston was traveled through the Mediterranean by sea. But above all, I think they have very different characters and voices. Montagu is aristocratic, witty, English. Her letters are addressed to figures like Alexander Pope and the Prince of Wales. So she was moving in very rarefied circles in both literary and cultural and social terms. Now, Henrietta Liston knew Montagu's Turkish letters. She alludes to them explicitly, but her style, her approach is quite different. She writes at one point quite wryly of Wortley Montagu's high colouring. Liston, as what Dora has already said, perhaps suggests, comes perhaps from a more sort of upper middle class background. She did have literary connections. They knew Walter Scott, who, interestingly, was a great admirer of the Liston's piggery, which he described as quite a palace in one of his letters. But there was a great deal of snobbery towards Henrietta Liston from her contemporaries. Lady Hester Stanhope, for example, that famous Queen of the Desert, another great woman traveler to the Middle East, anticipated that Liston would be a vulgar, pedantic, talking woman. She predicted that she will be laughed at Constantinople, I'm sure. And Stanhope's lover, Michael Bruce, who dined with the Listons at the British Embassy in Constantinople, wrote to Stanhope describing Liston as short and thick, and I should think not half so genteel as your housekeeper, Mrs. Brown. He went on, she has a dash of Scotch cleverness and a considerable one of Scotch vulgarity. Now, Liston's Scotch cleverness and what Bruce would calls her vulgarity, but what I think I'd prefer to describe as her more down-to-earth and homely approach, comes through in many ways, perhaps most obviously or most immediately in her comparisons of Turkey with British life, which have a real immediacy, I think, because of this. So, for example, when she's describing a meal with Turkish hosts soon after she's first arrived in Turkey, she describes how their dishes are placed upon a stool upon a large round tin tray. resembling our girdle or the griddle in Scotland for baking cakes. When she's describing her breakfast at the house of a local Aga in Bunabasha near Troy, she talks about the Turkish dressed milk as being like Devonshire clotted cream. But my favorite example comes from her account of the whirling dervishes. Like Montagu, she went to see the whirling dervishes, and she writes an actually much longer account. At a certain point, she compares how the dervishes began to wheel round, extending their arms and making by means of their wide petticoats what children call making cheeses. And this is a reference to a children's game of the time where girls would spin around so their skirts and petticoats flew out, and sing this song with a chorus of turn cheeses turn. In her account of the whirling dervishes, I think we can also see how she's consciously or unconsciously often perhaps writing with Montagu in mind, and to some extent her views are perhaps shaped by the expectations formed by reading Montagu. So Montagu described the whirling dervishes as ridiculous on the one hand, but also as touching, as moving. In Liston's much longer description, she echoes this. She says, the scene altogether was ridiculous, but not laughable. There was a quiet solemnity in their movements, a sort of grace in their obeisances, a melancholy paleness in their looks, which rendered it, with their sweet-toned flute, interesting. I think that word interesting, which in some ways might seem quite banal, but I think it's a very Liston-y word. She's always interested, always curious in what she sees around her, in how others are seeing her, how she's perhaps disrupting their lives or amusing them, but she's never really sort of pushing herself into the foreground of her own account. She's rarely amazed or repulsed. She takes everything in with a critical intelligence. And I think we see this perhaps most clearly, or in a particularly nice way, in her account of a visit to the harem of the Kaimakam, the deputy Grand Vizier, in August 1813. There's a long description in the journal, in which you'll find in the book, of her visit, where she sits down with the women and converses through an interpreter with them. She declines to smoke a pipe, but she takes snuff with them. She admires the women's clothing and describes it in great detail, again, in some ways echoing Montagu. She talks a lot of how great the food is. I know some of you might be holding up your dinner to attend this, so just to get your appetites going. She talks of the soup made of rice and very highly seasoned. She talks of another dish, kebab, a favorite one with Turks of all ranks, she notes. I thought it excellent, she tells us. But she's not particularly overwhelmed or impressed by the Hall of Justice of the Imperial Council, which she's shown round. But she does write of being astonished at the expedition with which the women eat with their fingers, taking up more at once, even of liquid, than I could with my spoon. And I was amused at their kindness. Whenever I managed my spoon so awkwardly as to take up very little, they never failed to fill it for me with their fingers. And she's very appreciative, in particular, of the connection she manages to make with the Turkish women she meets. She goes on and notes The dishes were numerous and removed with almost as much celerity as at Sancho's government dinner. Plates being whipped away as soon as they're finished. A little allusion to Don Quixote there. So she, at the end of this account, she looks back at the day's entertainment and notes that it had in no way answered my expectations as to splendor or female beauty. But she notes, I was yet extremely pleased at having passed so many hours with a group of Turkish women, and to see enough of their characters and manners to enable me to form some idea of their humor and mode of life. I found them much more cheerful, happy, and good-natured than I had expected. I understand that they are pretty much occupied, the lower class in cooking and in making confectionery, of which all the people of this country eat a great deal, and the upper ones in making their clothes and in embroidery. So this is, I think, just a really interesting example of Liston's voice and her view. Montagu famously described Turkish women's remarkable beauty in erotically charged language that had a great influence on later Orientalist accounts and images of Turkey. But I think Liston here is really sort of undoing that idea of the harem as a site of dark sexual delights, of indolence, of beautiful enslaved women with nothing to do all day but sort of lounge around in the nude, waiting for Ingres to paint them. Liston's account sort of very, very unobtrusively unpicks this. You know, the Turkish women she meets are cheerful and good-natured, but certainly not indolent, not lazy. They're all employed. She does this though in such an engaged and engaging manner, I think, that we don't really notice perhaps how she's responding to Montagu and to these already well-established tropes about the Ottoman world, and in this case the harem in particular. So I think I will leave it there. I'm going to hand over to Özden, who will tell you a bit more, I think, about that Ottoman world and Liston's engagement with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Dora. I hope you can hear me. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you everybody for joining us today in this event. As Dora already mentioned, this book brought together a group of people coming from different disciplines and fields of interest. When I first heard about the project, I got very much interested because till then I only knew Lady Mary Montagu as the only English ambassadress writing about her travels in the Ottoman lands. In fact, Montagu's letters achieved great fame when published after her death. However, Henrietta's journal was virtually unknown. Thus, my initial interest developed into a strong enthusiasm to find more about this treasure. Thanks to Dora, we have been able to discover a remarkable archive full of written and visual materials. The fact that Henrietta stayed in the Ottoman capital quite a long time, more or less 8 years, and provided observations on various issues, makes her journal a valuable historical source for us. It offers a glimpse into the early part of Sultan Mahmud II's reign, when the political crises were largely settled, but radical reforms had yet to be realized. A period which has been relatively unexplored in recent scholarship. Besides her fascinating observations on sultanic power, domestic politics, and foreign relations, Henrietta's insightful remarks on plague, fires, ceremonies, Ottoman women, as well as non-Muslim communities are of particular importance. Today, I'm going to talk about Henrietta's experience of plague, her circles and sources of information in the Ottoman capital, and her observations on Sultan Mahmud II, in order to give you a little bit flavor for what is in the book. Henrietta and her husband, Robert, arrived in Pera, Constantinople in late June. As you can see on the map, at the time, Pera was the district where Europeans lived and had their embassies. And their arrival coincided with one of the worst plague epidemics suffered by the city in the 19th century, lasting from 1812 to 1819. Henrietta notes that after her arrival, she didn't stir from the British palace in Pera, except to go by water to Büyükdere because of the plague, which struck mainly Pera and Galata. And its peak killed more than 1,000 people per day, according to the contemporary Ottoman historian Cabi Ömer Efendi. In her letter to Dick Ramage, Robert Liston's nephew, Henrietta also writes, I quote, "They often died 1,000 a day," unquote, which is in line with the contemporary European and Ottoman estimates. She also describes in some detail the precautions taken against the disease. Their provisions were handed into the porter and by him plunked in tubs of water, while letters and papers, etc., were fumigated on a machine placed for the persons at the gate. And even visitors sometimes underwent this operation, which was called perfuming. Next slide, please, Dora. Yes. Here we can see that she gave a detailed explanation of the method perfuming. In fact, in this method, fuels such as juniper berries, fragrant gums, and resins were used along with straw to create smoke in order to disinfect letters and papers. Despite periods of confinement and restrictions on movement due to the plague, the Listons' residence in Büyükdere and their links with the diplomatic circles there provided Henrietta space for sociability. At the time, many foreign embassies and wealthy merchants had summer residences in Büyükdere, which was located on the European side of Bosphorus between Sarıyer and Kefeliköy. Among them, there were Russian ambassador, Sicilian ambassador, Spanish minister, and Swedish ambassador. Thanks to her contacts here, Henrietta was able to acquire information and rumors on various issues going on within the Ottoman Empire, including the mysterious murder of the Ottoman court physician, Dr. Lorenzo Nucrola, and the execution of the Morissi brothers acting as drogomans at the Ottoman court. Moreover, her sex and social rank as British ambassadress allowed her a great privilege of getting access to various circles, including the parts of the Sultan's entourage and the upper echelons of Ottoman society. For instance, she wrote of meeting the Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet on board of his ship. Like Montagu, Henrietta had first-hand experience of the harem. As Patrick already mentioned, she visited Kaymakam Rüştü Mehmet Paşa's harem at the Sublime Porte in Turkish Balbali, which also housed all the offices of state and the imperial council chambers. Besides her detailed descriptions about the furnishings of the rooms and characters, dress, and manners of Ottoman women, her account of the conversation with the Kaymakam's wife on political relations between the English and the Ottomans is particularly interesting. In this conversation, the wife says, I quote, "Many good Turks thought the English the best allies Turkey could have because they had always found them upright and honest and not telling lies," unquote. And Liston replies, quote, "She believed it to be the wish of England that the Turks should continue great and independent," unquote. During this visit, she also had the opportunity to observe the Sultan in his council and visit the public rooms at the Wabali. One of the striking details Henrietta provides in her journal is about the dismissal of Ottoman viziers. She notes that if a vizier was dismissed as a result of momentary disgust or some very trifling offense, an officer would enter his room with a piece of cotton cloth and wipe his pen, which meant the vizier was deprived of his title and exiled. And in the case of more serious offenses, he would be executed. As earlier travel accounts do not mention such a practice, it could be considered as an original piece of information provided by Henrietta. And it could also indicate the degree to which she was harvesting information about Ottoman culture as well as administrative structure. Finally, Henrietta's remarks on Sultan Mahmud II are of importance. Describing him as a man of talents as well as a bigot, she provides keen observations with regard to the Sultan's character and policies during this period. The conditions that paved the way for Mahmud II's accession to the throne were quite chaotic. In 1807, Sultan Selim III was dethroned by the Janissary-led rebellion, and later he was killed. Mustafa IV succeeded him, but he was also deposed. And Mahmud II, as the sole male heir, ascended the throne in 1808. The arrival of the Listons in the Ottoman capital in 1812 coincided with the first phase when Mahmud II tried to restore the Sultanic authority. As can be seen from Liston's remarks, the Sultan was more determined yet more cautious than his predecessors in his reform efforts, particularly in reforming the Janissaries. Next slide, please. Yes. In fact, he abolished the Janissary Corps in 1826, that is 6 years after the Listons had departed. In fact, Henrietta's approach to this matter is quite distinctive. Next slide, please. Thanks. She considered such potential reform as dangerous, since it would, she says, be taking the chain from a tiger and setting him loose on the country. For Henrietta, the presence of the Janissary army was indispensable, as it could keep in check the exercise of sultanic power. Her comments are noteworthy in terms of demonstrating foreign perspective towards the Ottoman attempts at military and administrative reforms, and reflecting contemporary concern with regard to the association of reforms with an autocratic sovereign. It can be said that Liston regarded the Sultan's absolute and arbitrary power as a significant threat to the state and social stability. Another significant aspect of the journal is Henrietta's vivid descriptions of Sultan Mahmud's public participation in various state and religious ceremonies, including his participation to Sure Ali, which was the annual procession celebrating the dispatch from Istanbul, gifts and money to the holy cities Mecca and Medina. This procession at that year was especially important because until then, both cities, Mecca and Medina, were under the control of the Wahhabis, and in 1812 and 13, they were recaptured from the Wahhabis in Arabia. So apart from this procession, his procession to mosque on the first day of Ramadan, his participation to the Feast of Sacrifice, and his visit of Galatasaray was narrated in detail, or described in detail by Liston. So his presence at these public ceremonies and his visibility and accessibility to his subjects could be taken as important steps to ensure legitimacy and to restore, in the eyes of his subjects and foreigners, sultanic image and power, which was already weakened with the deposition of Selim III in 1807. In conclusion, I think Henrietta's journal is very important primary source on the early years of Sultan Mahmud II's reign, especially providing a perceptive account of the Ottoman Empire on the eve of reforms. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Usted and Patrick, for those fascinating insights. if I can just get to my next slide. So as I mentioned at the beginning, alongside our publication, we have added all of the Turkish journals to a new digital resource that is hosted by the National Library of Scotland. And on your screen just now, you can see the homepage for the Travels of Henrietta Liston, and then one of the screens that enables you access through to all of the digitized journals. So please, after this event, if you're interested, do explore the resource, because not only does it have all of the digitized manuscripts, but a series of long reads from a number of authors and scholars that provide an even wider context for Henrietta's Turkish writings. In addition, we have also created, with Chris Fleet, our excellent map curator here at the library, an interactive map application that enables you to trace the Liston's travels, both in the US and in Europe, and specifically in Turkey, and to gain access from this map straight through to the digitized journals themselves. So if you are interested, for example, in finding out what Henrietta said about a particular place, and you can click on that place and it will give you the list of journal pages where she describes the place, and you can go through and explore the journals in that way. We are also on Twitter. Henrietta is also on Twitter, and I've just popped the web link to the digital resource at the bottom there. So as your questions are coming in, I'll just show you our book, and if you're interested in buying our book, the paperback is on sale through the National Library of Scotland's online shop at the discounted price of £16.99, and it was originally £19.99. So if you're interested, the link for that is not only on our events page on the National Library of Scotland website, but you can also get it straight through the National Library of Scotland's website in the shop section. Now I think we're probably ready to hand over to Joe and Kenny for questions.
Thank you, Dora, and thanks everybody for a lovely evening of conversation. I am going to see if Joe has the first question. But before I think you're going to give us the result of the poll, Joe.
I am. The results are in, hot off the press. So our question to you was, are you familiar with Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, and her Turkish embassy letters? So 10% of you have read the letters, 30% of you have heard of them, or you've heard of Lady Montagu, and 60% of you haven't heard of her or the letters. So that's quite interesting research that I'm sure will feed into future research projects that may be bubbling away. So thank you for adding those. Now, our first question, now this was a question specifically for you, Patrick, but if anyone else has any insights, please do jump in. So the first question is, I was wondering whether or not, now I'm not sure if this is Henrietta or Lady Montagu, so maybe you can comment on both, whether they learned Ottoman Turkish, sorry, well, Henrietta was in Istanbul, beg pardon. Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay, Dora might be better placed to answer this, but as far as I know, she didn't. Okay. Or certainly never got to a point where she was fluent. I think, you know, given her husband's incredible linguistic skills, I don't know whether there was maybe a temptation to rely on him, or you know, it's possible he may have helped her learn a little Turkish, but I don't think she did, unless Dora can tell us otherwise.
Just a quick note, she uses some Turkish words in her journal, but most of them are wrongly written. So
maybe that answers the question then.
Yeah, she didn't speak, but she went everywhere with an interpretess, I think, or almost everywhere with an interpretess. She mentions a few visits where she was accompanied, and then one visit in particular, where an impromptu visit to some Turkish women, where she wasn't accompanied by an interpretess, and they had to communicate through signs. So I think it was Robert that was learning Ottoman Turkish, and I actually think that he wasn't fluent, but he could read it. But he also had his dragomans who interpreted for him.
I think as well, the journal covers, deals with Liston's first journey to Turkey and her first sort of few years living there. So again, we do have material from sort of later, sort of 1819, 1820, but it's, you know, there's maybe by then she'd picked up a little more, but I suspect not.
She had her name engraved in Turkish on a piece of jewelry, so there was obviously a fondness for the language.
Oh, thank you all very much.
Okay, I just realized I need to put more money in my meter to get better lighting in my room. So everybody out there, I do apologize for looking as if I'm in a cell. But I will go to the next question. The next question is from Lois. Lois, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Lois's question out to everyone, I think, is: we heard the rather uncivil opinion Lady Stanhope had for Henrietta. Do we know what Henrietta thought of Lady Stanhope?
Well, we know that Henrietta was fascinated by Stanhope, and was asking her friends about, you know, where is Lady Stanhope, what's she up to now? And there was a kind of a gossipy quality to the way that she's discussing her. But we also know that Robert helped Lady Stanhope on her quest for treasure and provided her with a warship to go off and try and find this obscure treasure. So the Listons were involved with Stanhope's quite extraordinary exploits, and I think there was a kind of fascination. But I think that Henrietta was more civil about Stanhope than Stanhope was about Henrietta.
Everybody is smiling, agreeing with you, I think, Dora. Joe, over to you for the next question.
Yeah, thank you very much. So this question comes from Jen Higgins. So she's asked, apart from the whirling dervishes, do you have any other favourite observations by Henrietta Liston? What were your favourite discoveries in your research?
Well, not maybe observation, but I think the remarks on the dismissal of the vizier, the ceremony for the dismissal of vizier is quite interesting, and really I couldn't find any earlier description of this. So probably Henrietta is the first person who wrote this, and because later accounts also mention, probably they copied from Henrietta or maybe other accounts, so it's still a mystery. But for me, this is one of the fascinating discoveries with regard to Henrietta's journal.
Great. Anyone else?
Well, I think one of the kind of the elements of her life in Turkey that we weren't able to fully explore in the confines of the book was her botanical work, what she was doing with the seeds and plants that she collected and how she planted the embassy garden. And I think that there are lots of little clues within the archive that we found in our research which indicate that there's a lot more research that could be done into her botany.
Lovely, thanks everyone for that one. Next question, I'm going to move on to Sandy McDonald. Sandy has asked, did Henrietta attempt to publish these journals in her lifetime?
Should I take that one, Dora?
Yes, yes.
I mean, I think we have no evidence that she did. It's one of the questions that most fascinates me is, who did Liston intend these journals for? Were they purely private? She talks in her letters to friends about meeting up when she's back in Scotland and them reading through the journals together, and perhaps reworking them. There are also sections where she clearly showed the journals to her husband. We've got other versions of passages that are in this main journal we find in elsewhere in the manuscript collection with Robert's handwriting, little sort of corrections and it seems suggested changes, which we then find in the main journal. It seems that she sort of incorporated into her journal, but in her own way, in using slightly different language. So I think her journal probably served a kind of social purpose, but I don't think it was intended for publication in print, at least. I think even around the beginning of the 19th century, we need to remember that a manuscript could be a kind of form of publication, perhaps for a fairly select group of friends and acquaintances. But to cut it short, no, I don't think she ever planned to have this printed and published.
Thanks, Patrick. Joe, we've still got a bit more time, so we can have another couple of questions. Next one from you.
Thank you, absolutely. So our next question is from Can Ozturk, and they've asked, my question relates to the presence of Greeks and Armenians in Istanbul. Did Henrietta perceive Istanbul as a Turkish and Muslim city, or was her perception more nuanced, accommodating the presence of non-Muslim and non-Turkish Ottomans living in Turkey?
I can say a couple of words on that. Well, actually, she talks a lot about other non-Muslim communities. She doesn't consider Turkey, Istanbul, as a kind of solely Muslim city. As for the Greeks, for instance, she described them as a degraded nation. This is one of the descriptions that came to my mind now. As for Armenians, she said that at the time they were the most powerful and the most wealthy community. And basically they acted, she wrote, they acted as bankers of the Sultan. Also they were controller of the mint. And she also gave some examples for these influential figures. And also for the Jews, she described them as the bankers of the Aga of the Janissary. So these are the small things that came to my mind now, but she mentions a lot. She gave reference to non-Muslim communities and their situation in the Ottoman Empire in her journal and in her letters.
I think
Sorry, Patrick, you go ahead.
No, I was just going to add one of my favorite passages is her description of when they're rowing up. I think, Dora, is it up the Bosphorus? And they have in her boat they have a Greek crew, and she talks about their. Dora might be able to help me. I can't remember the exact language she uses, but their anti-Turkish feeling and resentment, and their desire to beat the Turkish boat that is rowing ahead. And there's this sort of constant game of the Liston sort of agreeing to give the Greek oarsmen at their head so that they can row and catch up and win this race, which isn't a race. So I think she is very interested in the minority communities in and around Constantinople and across the Ottoman Empire.
And also when they first arrived to the Ottoman Empire in the Dardanelles, as far as I remember, also in their stay, during their stay in Bursa, they were all received by the church, by the priests there, no? As far as I remember. So they also made visits to Greek Orthodox Church and received by the Orthodox priests in these cities, as far as I remember.
That brings us nicely on a question from Irene. Irene's asking that would they be given information about specific cultural aspects before they moved there, for example, behaviours?
Well, Robert Liston had been before to Turkey as ambassador, but just for a very short period of time in 1794. So he was kind of initiated, and I'm sure filled Henrietta in. I don't know what formal kind of methods of telling diplomats how to behave there were. Maybe Øystein, you can shed a little light, or maybe we'll need to go away and look into that, but certainly nothing we'd come across was a kind of code of behavior. But Robert was used to maneuvering within Constantinople from his former embassy.
Lovely, thanks, Dora. I think we've got time for a couple more. Jo, if you want to ask the next question.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next question is from Heather Young, and I have to say I've picked it because I'm quite interested myself. So thanks, Heather. So she has asked, are there any plans for doing more research into Henrietta's amateur botanical work, both in Turkey and America, as well as her replanting of various specimens in Scotland? She's also asked, is it known how far the reach of her seed and plant collecting was in terms of sending abroad?
Yeah, I mean, there are no concrete plans at the moment to take this forward. At least I don't have any, but I know that the Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh, the Royal Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh, have some excellent archival material that documents how many seeds were being sent from Turkey to Edinburgh and what was planted by the botanics and who it went to. So there's definitely research that we could do in collaboration with the archivists there, and I have been in touch with them. I believe there is some other material in Italy that Henrietta sent, and we certainly know that she had quite a wide network of other amateur botanists. There was John Barker, who was a consul in Aleppo, I think, and they were exchanging seeds and nectarine plants and all kinds of things. So there's a lot of potential there to trace what happened. Her American garden, which was very well known at the time that she planted it, is unfortunately no longer in existence at Millburn Tower where they lived, but I'm sure that it's very well documented in the archives, so work could be done to kind of recreate it from the archival sources.
Sounds like it could be a lovely project for somebody.
Yeah, a lovely project.
Thanks for that, Dora. We got time for one last question before we go and put money in the meter, get lights on and get the heating on as well, I have to say. Can I just ask, why did you decide to modernize Liston's journal when publishing it?
I think I'll take this one. We had lots of conversations within our sort of editorial team about how to deal with Liston's manuscripts and the main journal in particular. And I think to begin with, we were working from a transcription that Dora did the vast majority of the work on, and the transcription is a wonderful thing to read, but it is a fairly sort of knotted, tangled thing. This is, I think, particularly towards the end of the journal, she seems to, this is my best guess, I can't say this for sure, but I think she may have started writing this up as a sort of, maybe not a presentation copy, but a neat copy, again, the sort of volume that she might have shared around with her friends. And then as she goes on, it gets more and more sort of messy and chaotic with more and more little insertions. And publishing it in that form, I think, where the grammar is often quite tricky, the syntax takes some piecing together. It's not an easy read, although a fascinating one. And it's, I think, the essential narrative and Liston's own voice is so fascinating and so powerful that we wanted to make this sort of as available to as many people as possible, as accessible as possible. So that was the main reason we decided to go with a modernized text, especially once we realized that we had this possibility of putting the transcriptions with the digitized facsimiles on this wonderful website of the National Libraries, so that I very much hope that people will do this. Those who are interested can look at Liston's manuscript. They can use the transcription to help them through it. But I think the book really gives us something you can read for pure pleasure. So that's the essence, I think, of why we went for a modernized text for the book.
That's
to
a wonderful,
have the best of both worlds, basically.
Absolutely, and I think that's a wonderful way to bring this this evening to a close. It's amazing that we're in Turkey, we're in California, and we're in George IV Bridge in Edinburgh, along in my sitting room and Joe's sitting room as well. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm going to leave the last word with Dora.
I would just like to thank Patrick and Liston on behalf of the National Library of Scotland for joining us and for giving us such a wonderful evening. And I would like to thank Kenny and Joe for looking after us all so well and for setting up this event and making it all possible. And thank you to everybody who asked a question. If there was anybody's question that we didn't get to and you would like to get in touch with us, please come through the National Library website and your query will be passed on to us, and we can all continue to explore Liston's journals together if you would like. Should you like to buy a copy of the book that Patrick just held up, the paperback, that is, as I mentioned, on sale through the National Library's shop. And that's all from us at the moment, but we are back next week with 2 events. On Tuesday, the 10th of November, we are joined by Mike Bullock, Chief Executive of the Northern Lighthouse Board, who will be here to discuss the mission and history of this remarkable organisation. Then on Thursday, the 12th of November, it is the annual Muriel Spark Lecture, given this year by poet and writer Fiona Sampson. So I hope you can join us for them. But for now, on behalf of Patrick, Uston and I, and on behalf of Henrietta, thank you again so much for joining us. Please take care and goodbye for now.
Thank you.